The gates of Magnolia Estate creaked open just as the summer sun lit up Charleston's cobblestone streets. A young woman walked in, carrying more memories than belongings. The house had seen her mother once before, years ago, and the walls still seemed to whisper her name. Emily Sanders had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times on the bus ride down from Columbia. She imagined stepping through those tall black iron gates, imagined the air heavy with the scent of magnolias, imagined the crunch of gravel beneath her shoes. Yet nothing prepared her for the weight she felt when she crossed the threshold. It wasn't just the estate's grandeur pressing down on her. It was the echo of her mother's silence. Sarah Sanders had always avoided talking about this place. She carried scars that Emily only partly understood, scars that smelled faintly of silver polish and sleepless nights. Now her daughter had returned, not as a guest, but as part of the staff. Charleston mornings in July carried that peculiar kind of humidity that clung to one's skin like an extra garment. Emily adjusted her faded cardigan over her freshly pressed uniform, a light blue dress with a white apron that she had borrowed from an aunt. She wanted to look neat, professional, but her nerves betrayed her. Her hands trembled as she held a small suitcase, her only luggage. Inside, tucked carefully between folded blouses, was her mother's silver locket, its hinges worn from years of being opened and closed in secret. At the steps of the estate stood Martha Johnson, the housekeeper who had worked there longer than Emily had been alive. Martha's face was lined with years of service and secrets, her eyes watchful yet not unkind. She greeted Emily with a curt nod, her southern politeness restrained but present. "You must be the new girl," she said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of someone who had seen many come and go. Emily simply nodded, murmuring a soft, "Yes, ma'am." That simple exchange carried more meaning than either acknowledged. Martha turned, leading her into the house without further words. Inside, the estate breathed wealth and history. Polished wooden floors reflected the soft morning light that streamed through tall windows. White columns framed the hallway, and heavy drapes in shades of burgundy whispered as they moved slightly in the breeze. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil and something older, something Emily couldn't name but felt in her bones. She followed Martha past portraits of stern-looking ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her. Each step deepened her unease, yet she steadied herself with the thought, "I'm here for a reason. I'm here for her." It didn't take long before Margaret Hayes made her appearance. Standing at the far end of the hallway, she was a figure of precision, her blonde hair arranged immaculately, her pearl necklace gleaming against a tailored cream blouse. Her gaze was sharp, assessing Emily as if she were inspecting a piece of china for cracks. Margaret didn't extend a hand. Instead, she let her eyes linger a moment before speaking. "Let's see if you last longer than the others." Her voice carried both elegance and disdain, the sort of tone that could make someone feel small without raising its volume. Emily lowered her gaze in respect but felt no warmth. She murmured, "Yes, ma'am," and held the silence. That had always been her mother's way to answer enough to keep peace, but never so much as to surrender completely. Margaret turned away with the faintest lift of her chin. "Polish the family silver," she said, her words like an edict. "Martha will show you where." It was no ordinary order. The Hayes silver had been the same set her mother once handled, the same set from which she was accused of stealing years ago. Emily felt the sting of history, though she kept her face composed. Martha caught the flicker in her eyes but said nothing, simply motioning toward the service wing. In the kitchen, sunlight streamed through wide windows, catching on pots and pans hung neatly on the wall. The smell of biscuits in the oven mixed with the sharper scent of cleaning supplies. Martha explained the rules of the household in a steady, practiced tone. The hours, the tasks, the expectations. There was no room for laughter, no space for missteps. Emily listened closely, nodding, taking it all in like a student memorizing formulas. It was the only way to survive here. Later, while unpacking in the small attic room assigned to her, Emily set her suitcase on the narrow bed. She lifted the locket, the one her mother had guarded so fiercely. Opening it, she saw the faded photograph of Sarah as a young woman, smiling with a hint of sorrow in her eyes. Emily touched the tiny image and whispered, "I'll find out what happened, Mom. I promise." The weight of her vow seemed to settle on her shoulders, but it gave her strength too. This wasn't just a job. It was a mission. As evening shadows stretched across the estate, Emily carried a tray of freshly polished silver into the dining room. The chandeliers sparkled above, the long oak table gleaming with the reflections of countless 4th of July dinners past. She set the silver down carefully, her movements precise. Margaret's footsteps echoed behind her, and though no words were exchanged, Emily felt the scrutiny, the judgment. She kept her hands steady, refusing to falter. On her way back to the service wing, Emily paused by a side table in the hallway. There, inside a modest frame, stood an old photograph. The edges were worn, the colors faded, but the image was unmistakable. Her mother, Sarah, standing in the estate's garden decades ago, wearing the same style of uniform Emily now wore. Her mother's face held the same mix of defiance and gentleness Emily carried. For a heartbeat, the present and past blurred, and Emily felt the breath catch in her throat. Emily noticed an old framed photo on the hall table, a blurred image of her mother standing by the estate's garden decades ago. The clatter of dishes in the kitchen masked hushed voices, but Emily caught one name that froze her heart. Sarah. The sound slipped out between two maids like a forbidden secret. Emily stood still at the sink, hands wet with soap, her eyes fixed on the stream of water, though her ears strained for every word. One of the girls whispered again, softer this time. "She reminds me of Sarah, don't you think?" The other glanced nervously toward the door. "Don't say that name here." Before more could be revealed, the swing door opened. Margaret Hayes glided in, her heels tapping lightly on the tiled floor. The air seemed to tighten, every maid straightening at once. Margaret carried herself like the mistress of a stage chin, lifted, lips pressed into a practiced smile. Her eyes swept the room, pausing on Emily with cold curiosity. Then she spoke, voice as smooth as porcelain. "Back to work." Silence fell heavier than the humidity outside. Pots clanged louder, spoons scraped faster, and the whisper of Sarah's name died in everyone's throats. Emily lowered her head, scrubbing harder, though her pulse still thundered. They know her. They all know my mother's story. But what story? Charleston's summer heat pressed through the kitchen windows, thick with cicadas humming from the oak trees. The smell of biscuits and fried chicken filled the air, comforting yet clashing with Emily's unease. She stole a glance at Martha Johnson. The older woman was slicing bread with careful precision, her shoulders heavy with something unspoken. Martha's eyes lifted briefly, met Emily's, and then turned away. It was a silent warning. Do not ask. By mid-afternoon, when the air outside shimmered in the heat, and even the birds hid in the shade, Martha found Emily folding linens in the laundry room. The air was damp with steam, the floor warm beneath bare feet. Martha closed the door gently before speaking. "Child," she said in a low voice, "don't ask too many questions. The past in this house, it's best left where it is." Emily wanted to argue. Every fiber in her body wanted to cry out, "That past is my mother's life." But Martha's face stopped her. The woman's lined features carried both care and guilt, and Emily could see she meant it as protection. Emily only nodded, forcing her voice to stay even. "Yes, ma'am." Left alone again, Emily pressed a stack of sheets onto the shelf. That was when she noticed faint letters carved into the wood, almost hidden under years of wear. S. She traced the grooves with her fingertip, her breath catching. Sarah Sanders. Her mother had stood here once, perhaps tired and alone, carving her name into the shelf as proof that she existed, that she mattered. Tears pricked Emily's eyes, but she blinked them away. She could not cry here, not yet. When evening fell, the staff gathered for supper at the long kitchen table. Plates of fried chicken, bowls of mashed potatoes, cornbread still warm from the oven, and jars of sweet tea covered the surface. Conversation was muted. The clinking of forks seemed louder than laughter, which was absent altogether. Emily sat near the end, eating quietly, listening to the small exchanges about chores and weather. Yet she noticed the sideways glances. Her presence stirred memories people didn't want to recall. Martha sat at the head of the table, her authority quiet but firm. She ate slowly, speaking little. Once, Emily thought she saw the woman's lips part, as if to say something, then close again. There was guilt in that silence, a guilt Emily longed to name. Later, during dinner service for the Hayes family, Emily carried a tray of dishes into the dining hall. The chandeliers glowed above, polished wood gleamed under her feet, and small flags decorated the mantel in anticipation of Independence Day. Margaret sat at the far end of the table, regal and cold, with her pearls gleaming in the light. Emily set the plates down carefully, her hands steady, though her chest pounded. She had nearly finished when Margaret's voice cut through the quiet. "Hopeless," she said, every syllable sharp. "Just like your mother." The words rang out like a verdict. The staff froze. No one breathed. Emily felt the sting on her cheeks, the fire climbing into her throat. Her first instinct was to shout, to defend her mother, to demand answers. But she remembered her mother's own silence, the dignity she had clung to despite humiliation. Emily lowered her eyes, hands folded tight, and stood in silence. Margaret smirked faintly, satisfied with the wound she had opened, and turned back to her meal. The rest of the evening blurred into tasks, scrubbing floors, stacking dishes, ironing linens. Yet everywhere Emily walked, the house seemed to whisper. A faint perfume in the hallway reminded her of her mother. A creak in the stair reminded her of nights listening to Sarah's stories about Charleston. Every detail seemed soaked in echoes of the past. Back in her small attic room, Emily sat on the narrow bed, suitcase open at her feet. She reached for the worn envelope she had carried all the way from Columbia. Inside was a letter her mother had written years ago, words Sarah had never spoken aloud. Emily unfolded the fragile paper, smoothing its creases with careful hands. "My dearest Emily," it read, "you may one day walk paths I once walked. If you do, remember this. Dignity is not inherited, it is defended." Emily read the line again and again. The ink faded, but strong. Her mother had given her a key, though the door had opened, remained hidden. She pressed the letter to her chest, whispering into the night air, "I'll defend it, Mom, I promise." Outside, cicadas droned on, and somewhere in the distance the bells of St. Michael's Church rang the hour. Emily closed her eyes, clutching the letter, and felt both sorrow and resolve settle in her chest. Her mother's silence had been a shield, but Emily knew she had come to break it. That night, Emily takes out her mother's old letter and wonders if Margaret was the reason behind Sarah's shameful dismissal. Evening settled slowly over Magnolia Estate, wrapping the house and gardens in a softer light. The fierce Charleston sun slipped down behind the Ashley River, leaving the sky painted in streaks of orange and lavender. Fireflies began their nightly dance among the magnolia blossoms, tiny sparks glowing and fading as if the air itself carried secrets. Emily stepped out onto the garden path, balancing a basket of folded linens. After the sharpness of the day, Margaret's remarks, Martha's warnings, the quiet hum of dusk felt like a balm. She paused near the rose bushes, taking in the air heavy with the scent of summer. For a moment, she let herself breathe, shoulders unclenching. Her mother had always spoken of Charleston's evenings with a wistful tone, though she had never explained why. Now Emily understood. There was beauty here, even under the weight of memory. Suddenly, a small burst of light startled her. Sparks fizzed against the twilight. A child's laughter followed. From behind the hedge came Lily Hayes, her curls bouncing, her white sundress swirling as she waved a sparkler through the air. She ran with the carefree delight of one who had never tasted shame or burden. Emily nearly dropped the basket. "Careful," she said quickly, setting the linens down. She crouched, holding out her hand. "You'll burn your fingers if you tilt it too low. Keep it pointed up." Lily stopped, eyes wide and curious. She studied Emily's face for a moment before grinning and handing her the sparkler. "You sound just like the lady in the picture." Emily blinked. "What picture?" "The one Daddy keeps in his office," Lily replied casually, as if sharing a simple fact. "By the river. She looks like you. Same eyes." She spun away before Emily could respond, tracing circles of light that faded into the darkening air. Emily's breath caught. A picture in Richard Hayes's office by the river? Her heart pounded with the thought. She had already glimpsed a hallway photo of her mother in Magnolia's garden. But if Richard kept another image, hidden away in his study, then the connection was far deeper than she dared imagine. Before she could gather her thoughts, the back porch light snapped on. Martha Johnson's voice carried across the lawn. "Lily, come back here before you set the whole garden ablaze." Lily groaned but skipped toward the porch, pausing just long enough to hand the sparkler now fizzing its last to Emily. "You keep it," she whispered, smiling as though sharing a secret treasure. Then she dashed inside. Emily stood frozen, clutching the stub of burnt wire. Martha lingered at the porch steps, arms crossed. Their eyes met briefly. In Martha's gaze, Emily read both warning and pity. The older woman shook her head almost imperceptibly, then turned back into the house. The next day, preparations for July 4th filled the estate with noise and movement. Flags were draped along the porch, crates of food carried through the service entrance, sweet corn, ribs, jars of pickles, bags of flour for pies. The scent of barbecue seemed to seep into every corner. Emily worked tirelessly, scrubbing, polishing, ironing, yet her mind remained fixed on Lily's words. She noticed how the child kept seeking her out. In the kitchen, while Emily kneaded dough, Lily popped her head in, cheeks sticky with jam. "Do you like fireworks?" she asked, licking her fingers. "I've only seen them from far away," Emily admitted, brushing flour from her apron. "My mom always worked on the 4th. We listened to the pops from the trailer park, but we never saw the sky light up." "Then you can come with us," Lily declared, her tone certain. "Daddy takes me every year. He won't mind, Em." The simplicity of the invitation stunned Emily. Her own memories of Independence Day were of empty rooms, of her mother returning exhausted long after the fireworks had ended. The idea of standing by the river, shoulder to shoulder with others, looking up as the sky cracked open in color, it felt almost too tender to imagine. Yet innocence could be dangerous. Emily caught Martha watching from the doorway, her expression tense. Later, when the kitchen quieted, Martha murmured low enough for only Emily to hear, "Children don't know the weight of words. Don't let her talk trouble you." But it did trouble her. Every syllable from Lily pressed harder on the questions Emily carried, questions she had traveled here to answer. That evening, after the household settled into its nightly rhythm, Emily found herself near the hallway outside Richard Hayes's study. The door was ajar, a ribbon of lamplight spilling across the polished floor. Her steps slowed. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder, then slipped inside. The study was a world apart from the rest of the house. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes on Charleston's history and law. The scent of leather and faint tobacco clung to the air. A brass lamp glowed on the desk. Papers were stacked neatly, a fountain pen resting precisely in place. And there, on the corner of the desk, stood a modest wooden frame. Emily's knees weakened. Inside the frame was a sepia photograph, her mother, Sarah, by the Charleston riverbank, her hair pulled back, her eyes clear and steady, her posture proud despite the simplicity of her dress. Around her neck hung the silver locket that now rested in Emily's suitcase upstairs. She reached out, fingertips trembling, but stopped just short of touching the glass. "Why would he keep this?" she whispered into the stillness. Did Richard love her mother? Did he know the truth of what happened here years ago? Why would Margaret, with her cruel disdain, allow such a picture to remain in plain sight? Her thoughts spun until the floorboard creaked behind her. Emily stiffened, pulse racing, but no one entered. She straightened quickly, forcing her hands to her sides. Gathering every ounce of composure, she slipped back into the hallway, heart pounding. Later, in her attic room, she sat on the narrow bed, staring at her mother's locket in her palm. The locket, the hallway photo, Lily's words, and now this picture in Richard's study, they were puzzle pieces, aligning toward a truth she wasn't ready to face, yet could no longer avoid. She pressed the locket against her chest, whispering to the shadows, "What were you hiding, Mom?" Emily seized the photo for herself later that night, a young Sarah by the river in Charleston, the same silver locket on her neck. Morning light spilled through the tall windows of Magnolia Estate, catching on the glass chandeliers and polished floors. Preparations for the grand July 4th dinner had begun in earnest. The smell of roasted meats and sweet rolls wafted from the kitchen, blending with the faint tang of lemon polish on the wooden banisters. Servants moved quickly but carefully, their footsteps echoing in the long hallways. The house seemed to hum with expectation, but beneath the polished surfaces, tension stirred like distant thunder. Emily rose early, her uniform freshly pressed, her hair pinned back neatly. She worked silently, carrying trays, ironing napkins, arranging flowers. On the outside, she was just another maid, but inside, questions gnawed at her. The photograph she had found in Richard Hayes's study still haunted her. Her mother's eyes gazed back at her from that frame by the river, the same locket she now carried upstairs. And then there was Lily's innocent remark, "She looks just like you." By mid-morning, cars rolled up the gravel drive. Guests had begun arriving for the celebration. Charleston's summer air shimmered with heat, and ladies in light dresses fluttered fans, while men in linen suits adjusted their ties. The dining hall was transformed long oak table covered in crisp white cloth, silver polished to a mirror shine, tiny flags placed delicately in crystal vases. The chandeliers glowed above, their light reflecting against glass and china, making the room sparkle as if ready for royalty. Margaret Hayes presided over it all, her presence as sharp as the cutlery she inspected. She floated from one servant to another, correcting, commanding, her smile reserved only for the arriving guests. To everyone else, her words carried edges. "Straighten that flag. Polishing streaks will not be tolerated. Emily, stand up straight." Each instruction fell like a whip masked in civility. Emily obeyed, but inside she felt the sting. Every time Margaret's eyes landed on her, Emily thought of her mother, accused and humiliated years ago. She bit her lip, whispering inwardly, "I won't let her break me." The afternoon grew heavier, clouds gathering over Charleston's skyline. By the time the last guest arrived, thunder murmured in the distance. Yet the storm outside was nothing compared to the one building within the walls. It was nearly dusk when Richard Hayes finally returned. The gravel crunched under the wheels of his black sedan as it pulled into the drive. The staff lined up in the front hall, their uniforms crisp, hands folded neatly. Emily stood among them, her heart pounding. She had never seen him before, only heard Martha's careful words about his presence, his travels, his business. Richard stepped through the door with the composure of a man accustomed to control. Tall, silver at his temples, suit pressed impeccably dark. He carried himself with calm authority. He greeted the staff with a polite nod, his eyes scanning the line. For a fleeting second, his gaze paused on Emily. Something in her face, her eyes, the shape of her jaw made him hesitate. But then his expression returned to neutrality, and he moved on. From the balcony above, Margaret descended gracefully, pearls gleaming, voice warm with affection. "Richard, at last, Charleston isn't the same without you." She kissed his cheek lightly, her smile more performance than sincerity. For the guests watching, they were the perfect couple. Emily, standing at the edge of the hall, felt the falseness cling to the air like perfume too strong. Dinner began. Laughter bubbled among the guests. Glasses of sweet tea and wine clinked together, and plates of barbecue, cornbread, and pie filled the table. Yet beneath the conversation, Richard's eyes drifted once more to Emily. He couldn't shake the resemblance. The memory of Sarah, her kindness, her quiet dignity stirred faintly, though he buried it quickly beneath small talk of business and travel. Margaret, however, noticed. She leaned closer to him between courses, her voice low but edged. "That new maid is already causing trouble. Clumsy, insolent." Her glance slid toward Emily with disdain. "I'm keeping an eye on her." Richard raised an eyebrow, surprised. He rarely interfered with household matters, trusting Margaret's oversight. Yet he found himself studying Emily again, searching her face as if it might answer questions he hadn't dared ask. Later, as the guests drifted toward the drawing room for coffee, Emily retreated briefly to the service corridor. She leaned against the wall, catching her breath. Her chest felt tight, caught between fear and curiosity. She had seen Richard's hesitation. Had he recognized her? Or was it just her imagination fueled by Martha's silence and Lily's words? Martha found her there, straightening a vase. "Keep steady," she murmured. "Storms pass, but truth stays." Emily met her eyes, seeing in them both caution and encouragement. She nodded silently. In the grand dining hall, Richard lingered after the guests had moved on. He stood near the mantel where small flags waved gently from a vase. His eyes wandered to the family portraits on the wall, then to the corner table where Margaret often arranged fresh flowers. He thought of Sarah, how long it had been since her name had crossed his lips. For a moment, the weight of unspoken history pressed heavily on him. Later, in the quiet of his study, Richard lit the brass lamp and sat at his desk. Papers lay before him, but his attention drifted. His gaze fell upon the photograph of Sarah by the river. He picked it up slowly, holding it in his hands, the storm's lightning flashing through the window behind him. In Sarah's face, he saw echoes that now stood in his hall, carrying trays, avoiding his eyes. Outside, the storm finally broke, rain hammering against the windows, wind rattling the shutters. Lightning illuminated the grand hallway where Margaret walked alone, her heels tapping deliberately against the floor. Her lips curved in a thin smile as she whispered to herself, "Tomorrow night, she won't stand in this house anymore." The morning of July 4th dawned heavy with heat, the kind that pressed against the skin and made the air shimmer above Charleston's cobblestones. By midday, the Ashley River lay still and bright, reflecting a sky washed in hard summer blue. At Magnolia Estate, preparations for the evening celebration filled every corridor. Servants bustled in and out of the kitchen, balancing trays of ribs and pies, while others hurried to hang bunting and polish the tall windows until they gleamed like mirrors. Emily rose with the sun, her apron crisp, her hair tied neatly back. She worked in silence, folding napkins into precise triangles, carrying buckets of flowers from the garden. The estate throbbed with anticipation, but in her chest a different rhythm beat, anxious, steady, defiant. The image of her mother in Richard Hayes's office still lingered, and Lily's innocent remark, "She looks just like you," wouldn't leave her mind. By late afternoon, the grand dining hall was transformed. A long oak table stretched the length of the room, covered in starched white linen. Silver gleamed beneath chandeliers that sparkled as if waiting for royalty. Tiny flags in crystal vases dotted the table, their colors bright against the dark wood. Outside, cicadas screamed from the magnolia trees, their chorus nearly as loud as the chatter of guests arriving in carriages and black sedans. The ladies wore pastel dresses that rustled as they walked, and the men sported seersucker suits, their laughter drifting across the porch. Margaret Hayes floated among them, pearls glowing against her cream silk gown, her smile practiced, her greetings warm but hollow. She was every bit the gracious hostess in front of Charleston society, but Emily knew the edge behind that charm. Richard Hayes arrived quietly, shaking hands, nodding politely. He looked tired from travel, but his suit was impeccable, his presence commanding. When his eyes caught Emily's across the room, she carrying a tray of glasses, her gaze lowered, something in him faltered. For a moment his step slowed, as if he were staring at a memory. Emily's pulse quickened, and she turned away before the weight of his eyes betrayed her trembling. Dinner began as dusk fell. Guests filled the hall with chatter, raising glasses of sweet tea and wine. Platters of ribs, bowls of potato salad, peach cobbler, and warm biscuits moved down the table. Candles flickered, chandeliers blazed, and the hum of voices carried over the clink of silver. The storm clouds gathering beyond the windows went unnoticed. Emily moved through it all like a shadow, placing dishes, refilling glasses, her posture straight though her chest burned. She felt Margaret's gaze on her constantly, sharp and waiting. The woman had been quiet all evening, but Emily could sense it, the calm before lightning strikes. It happened in a heartbeat. Emily set a dish of green beans before a guest when Margaret's voice cut across the hall. "Stop." The word landed with the weight of a gavel. Forks paused midair. Voices died into silence. Margaret's eyes locked on Emily, her smile faint but cruel.
"The tray,"
she said, her tone slicing through the quiet.
"Missing a piece, isn't it?"
Emily's throat tightened. "Ma'am?" Margaret leaned back in her chair, tapping her pearl necklace with one manicured finger. "Curious, isn't it? First week in this house, and already something goes missing. Just like before." Her words lingered, sharp as glass. "Just like your mother." Gasps stirred among the guests. A couple exchanged awkward glances. Others looked down at their plates. The servants along the walls bowed their heads, bracing for the blow. Emily felt heat rush to her cheeks. Her hands trembled, but she held the tray steady. "I haven't taken anything," she said softly, her voice clear enough to reach the far corners of the hall. Margaret's smile didn't waver. "They all say that. Insolent, clumsy, dishonest. You are your mother's child, through and through." For a long moment, silence pressed down like thunder waiting to break. Emily's heart pounded, but she remembered the line in Sarah's letter. "Dignity is not inherited, it is defended." She stood a little taller, refusing to bow. Richard shifted in his seat, surprise flickering across his face. He looked from Margaret to Emily, confusion and unease etched in his expression. "Margaret," he said slowly, "is this necessary?" "Necessary?" she repeated, her voice laced with false sweetness. I am protecting this house from a repeat of past humiliation. She gestured at Emily with a careless flick of her hand. She is her mother's echo, and we all know how that story ended. Emily's chest tightened, but before she could speak, Martha Johnson stepped forward from the corner of the room. Her apron was still dusted with flour, her shoulders tense, but her voice carried steady and clear. That's enough. The words rang louder than Margaret's accusation. Every guest turned in shock. Martha, the quiet housekeeper who never raised her voice, was breaking the unspoken rule of silence. Margaret's eyes blazed. Martha, sit down. You forget your place. But Martha didn't move. Her voice trembled only slightly as she continued. For years I held my tongue. I said nothing when Sarah was accused. I swallowed every lie told in these walls, but not tonight. Not again. The chandeliers glittered. The storm outside rumbled closer. Emily's eyes filled. Her breath caught. She had never expected this Martha, stepping into the storm, risking everything for her. The guests shifted uneasily, sensing history unraveling before them. Some glanced at Richard, others at Margaret. Richard remained frozen, his brow furrowed, his eyes narrowing as though pieces of a puzzle were sliding into place. Margaret rose from her chair, her composure cracking. You dare, she began, her voice trembling with fury. Martha's face was pale but resolute. Her hand shook as she pulled something from the pocket of her apron. Everyone deserves to hear the truth. Lightning flashed through the tall windows, throwing long shadows across the table. Martha stands up, voice trembling but firm. That's enough. Everyone needs to hear the truth. The storm outside Magnolia Estate roared louder than the chatter within. Rain lashed against tall windows, streaking them with silver lines, while thunder rolled across the Ashley River like a drum echoing judgment. Inside the dining hall, chandeliers glowed above a long oak table laden with crystal and polished silver. Yet no sparkle could distract from the sudden, crushing silence. Martha Johnson stood at the far end of the hall, apron dusted with flour. Her shoulders squared, though her hands trembled. For years, she had lived in the background, serving, cleaning, swallowing truths. Tonight, her voice broke the pattern. That's enough, she said, every syllable trembling yet unshakable. Everyone needs to hear the truth. Gasps fluttered around the table. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to lower their eyes or lean in. Margaret Hayes, standing tall at the head of the table, fixed Martha with a cold smile sharp enough to cut glass. Sit down, she said icily. You forget your place. But Martha didn't sit. For decades she had obeyed, but silence had eaten her alive. Tonight the storm outside gave her courage. She reached into her apron and drew out a small phone, its glow soft but defiant in her palm. Not this time, she whispered, then louder. Not anymore. Richard Hayes frowned, his fork clattering onto his plate. What is this, Martha? Her thumb tapped the screen. A voice filled the hall, not Martha's, not Emily's, but Margaret's. Venomous, unmistakable, hopeless, just like your mother. I'll destroy you the same way I destroyed Sarah. The words reverberated like thunder. A woman at the table gasped, pressing her hand to her pearls. A man muttered a prayer under his breath. Servants along the wall stiffened, some looking at the floor, others at Emily, who stood frozen with a tray in her hands. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. The words stabbed deep. Her mother's ghost called forth in front of them all, but there was release, too. Finally, Margaret's cruelty was exposed, her mother's dignity defended by truth spoken aloud. Richard pushed his chair back and rose, every eye following him. His hand shook slightly as Martha offered him the phone. He pressed replay. Again the words spilled into the room. Hopeless, just like your mother. I'll destroy you the same way I destroyed Sarah. When the recording ended, Richard lowered the phone with deliberate care, as though its weight were unbearable. He looked at his wife, voice low but trembling. Margaret, what have you done? Margaret's brittle laugh cut the silence. Taken out of context. You'd believe the gossip of servants? Really, Richard? But before she could finish, a smaller, purer voice broke through. Lily, seated at the end of the table, leaned forward, her curls bouncing as she spoke. Daddy, she said simply. She looks like the lady in the river picture, the one you keep in your office. A hush, deeper than before, fell over the hall. Even the storm outside seemed to pause. Richard's body went rigid. Slowly, almost unwillingly, his gaze shifted to Emily. Emily's breath caught. The tray in her hands felt impossibly heavy. She could feel every guest's eyes on her, waiting. Richard stared at her, as though seeing a ghost. Her face, the tilt of her chin, the quiet strength in her eyes was achingly familiar. And at her neck, faintly visible above her apron, was a silver locket. His locket. Sarah's locket. "Sarah," Richard whispered, the name breaking like glass from his lips. His eyes glistened with a pain held too long. Margaret slammed her hand against the table. Dishes rattled. "Stop this nonsense," she spat. "She's nothing but a maid, a nobody." Richard's fist came down on the oak table with a thunderous crack. The chandeliers trembled. "Silence!" His voice boomed louder than the storm. Guests jolted. Servants stiffened. Margaret's mouth fell open. Her face drained of color. He turned back to Emily, his chest heaving. His voice was softer now, raw. "Tell me," he said, almost pleading, "your mother's name." Emily's throat burned. Tears threatening. She wanted to run, to hide. But the words forced their way out. "Sarah," she whispered, steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Sarah Sanders." A collective gasp swept the room. A woman crossed herself. Martha bowed her head, whispering a prayer. Richard closed his eyes, his face breaking under decades of guilt. "God forgive me," he murmured. All this time, memories rose unbidden. He saw Sarah's laughter in the garden, the way she once saved his daughter from choking on a peach slice, the fire in her eyes when she swore she hadn't stolen a thing. He had known she was innocent, yet he had remained silent, bound by Margaret's threats, by his own cowardice. The shame of that silence had haunted him every day since. He opened his eyes, tears glistening. "Margaret lied. She accused Sarah, and I—" His voice broke. "I let her. I let Sarah walk out of this house in disgrace, when she was the most honest soul ever to walk these halls." Margaret's voice shrieked in protest. "Richard, you'll ruin yourself. You'll ruin us all." But he cut her off with a steel edge in his tone. "No, Margaret, you ruined us long ago." He drew a shuddering breath. "Pack your things. Tonight, this house is no longer yours to poison." Gasps rippled again. Some guests whispered furiously. Others stared at their plates, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Servants exchanged glances, wide-eyed with disbelief. Martha pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming silently. Richard turned back to Emily. His gaze softened, filled with sorrow and something else recognition. "I can't undo the past. I can't bring her back, but I won't let history repeat itself." His voice dropped, nearly breaking. "Emily, you are my daughter." The chandeliers seemed to dim, the storm outside quieting, as though listening. Emily's knees weakened, her breath hitched, tears spilling over. She had imagined truths, prayed for answers, but hearing the words spoken aloud, "my daughter," was like the earth shifting beneath her. Margaret staggered backward, fury etched on her face. "You're a fool, Richard! A sentimental fool!" But Richard ignored her. His eyes never left Emily. They pleaded, begged for forgiveness, for a chance, for something to bridge the years lost. The silence stretched. Every soul in the room waited, hearts suspended in the balance. Emily thought of her mother's letter. Dignity is not inherited, it is defended. Tonight, she had defended it. And yet, as she looked at the man before her, broken and repentant, something deeper stirred, something her mother might have wanted her to give. Her lips trembled, but she forced the word out, fragile yet strong enough to fill the hall. "Dad." The storm had passed, leaving Magnolia Estate wrapped in a damp hush. Raindrops clung to the tall windows like tiny jewels, reflecting the glow of the chandeliers that still burned overhead. The dining hall remained frozen in silence, though Margaret's absence, her hurried footsteps echoing down the corridor as she retreated to her room, left a strange emptiness in her place. The guests, shaken and murmuring, slowly excused themselves, leaving half-eaten pie and untouched glasses of wine. One by one, the front doors closed behind them until only the staff, Richard, Emily, and Martha, remained. Richard stood at the head of the table, shoulders sagging as if decades of hidden guilt had finally caught up with him. His silver hair was damp from the storm, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He looked at Emily, But the courage to speak seemed to falter. For the first time, this man who commanded boardrooms and estates looked small, less a master of his house than a father undone by his own mistakes. Emily stood near the wall, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. The words she had spoken Dad still echoed in her ears. It had escaped her lips, like a secret she hadn't known she was keeping. Now it hung between them, fragile and powerful. She wasn't sure if she regretted it, or if it was the very thing she had needed to say all along. Martha stepped forward, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft but firm. "Mr. Hayes, the truth was long overdue. Tonight you did what you should have done years ago, but words won't be enough." She glanced at Emily, then back at him. "She deserves more than recognition. She deserves reparation." Richard nodded slowly, his throat working as he swallowed. He stepped toward Emily, his movements deliberate, as though afraid any sudden gesture might shatter the fragile moment. "Emily," he began, voice low, "I failed your mother. I stood by when she was cast out, when her name was dragged through the mud. I knew she was innocent, yet I let fear guide me. Margaret threatened to take Camilla, my daughter, then. Just a child if I opposed her. And I was a coward." Emily's chest tightened. The explanation, though raw, did not erase the wound. "You let her suffer alone," she said, her voice trembling. "And you let me grow up never knowing the truth." Richard's eyes glistened. He bowed his head. "I know, and nothing I say will erase that. But I beg you, let me spend the rest of my life making it right. Not just for your mother, but for you." The words were heavy with sincerity, yet Emily hesitated. She thought of Sarah, of nights watching her mother scrub diner counters, of evenings when Sarah came home exhausted, still offering a tired smile and a story before bed. Emily had carried her mother's strength, but also her silence. Was it fair to forgive so quickly? Martha touched Emily's shoulder gently. "Child," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years, "sometimes redemption is not about forgetting the hurt, but about giving space for healing." Emily closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. She wanted to believe that her mother would want this, that Sarah, who had spoken of dignity and love even in her hardest hours, would urge her daughter to open a door rather than close it. Slowly, Emily nodded. Richard exhaled, as though he had been holding his breath for years. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, worn smooth at the edges. "Your mother gave me this on her last day here," he said softly. "She asked me to keep it safe until the right time." He placed it on the table between them, his hand lingering before pulling away. Emily opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside were letters tied with a faded ribbon, Sarah's handwriting curling across each envelope. On top lay a single sheet of paper written in her firm but gentle hand. "If one day my daughter walks these halls, tell her the truth. Tell her she carries not shame, but dignity." The room blurred through Emily's tears. She clutched the letter to her chest, feeling her mother's presence, as if she stood beside her. The pain of loss surged anew. But so did the warmth of love, her mother's words reaching across years to remind her she was never alone. Richard stepped closer. "Emily," he said, voice breaking, "I cannot change the past, but I can give you my name, my home, my protection. Not as charity, as your father. If you'll let me." For a long moment, Emily said nothing. Then she raised her eyes, meeting his. "I don't need protection," she whispered. "What I need is the truth, and you've finally given it. That's enough for now." Her words carried both mercy and boundary, a daughter's tentative gift of grace. Richard nodded, tears streaking his face, and whispered, "Thank you." The staff, who had watched silently, now exhaled together. Martha smiled through her tears, relief softening her features. For the first time in decades, the air in Magnolia felt lighter, as though the very walls sighed with release. That night, Emily sat alone in her small attic room, the box of letters on her lap. She read until the candles burned low, her mother's words pouring into her like water to parched ground. Downstairs, Richard moved slowly through the halls, touching the portraits, the polished banisters, the places where Sarah's laughter still lingered. He had begun the long road of redemption, and though the path would not be easy, the first step had been taken. Emily drifted to sleep, clutching her mother's letter, her heart heavy, yet strangely lighter than ever before. In the quiet hours of the night, Richard stood at the window of his study, looking out at the magnolia trees swaying in the damp breeze. "Sarah," he whispered into the dark, "I failed you once, but I will not fail her." The vow hung in the silence like a prayer. The dawn after the storm broke quietly over Charleston. The Ashley River shimmered with soft light, and the magnolia trees surrounding the estate carried the fragrance of fresh rain. Magnolia Estate, for the first time in decades, felt different. The heavy air of fear and silence had lifted. What remained was fragile, tentative like the hush after a hymn ends, but it was real. Emily woke early in her small attic room, sunlight filtering through the narrow window. The wooden box of her mother's letters rested on the nightstand, the ribbon still tied neatly. She touched it with reverence, as though each envelope carried not just words, but a heartbeat. Last night she had read until her eyes blurred, Sarah's voice pouring from every page. Stories of endurance, reminders of dignity, whispers of love. Those letters had been her mother's legacy, now entrusted to her. She rose, smoothed her apron, and stepped quietly into the hall. Below, the house stirred to life, but gone was the tense rhythm of yesterday. Servants moved with lighter steps, exchanging cautious smiles. Martha stood in the kitchen, humming softly as she kneaded dough, something Emily had never heard before. The clatter of pots and pans sounded less like chains, more like music. Richard entered soon after, dressed plainly, without the polished armor of a businessman. His eyes sought Emily immediately. She hesitated in the doorway, unsure how to greet him. For so long, he had been a figure of distance, of wealth and authority. Now he stood as a man humbled, a father, unsure. "Good morning," he said softly, almost tentative. Emily nodded. "Morning." The word felt ordinary, yet it carried the weight of a bridge being built. Over breakfast, something remarkable happened. For the first time, Richard joined the staff at their table in the kitchen. He sat at the far end, folding his hands, bowing his head as Martha muttered a blessing over biscuits and eggs. The servants glanced at one another, bewildered, before settling into the meal. Emily sat quietly, her mother's locket resting against her collarbone, watching the man who had once allowed silence to ruin lives, now choosing to break bread among those he had overlooked. Later that day, Richard called the staff together in the dining hall. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, glinting off the silver that only last night had been a symbol of accusation. He cleared his throat, voice rough. "This house has been a place of fear for too long," he said. "That ends today. Emily will serve as supervisor of the household. Any mistreatment of her or of any one of you will be answered directly by me." Gasps and murmurs spread. Martha blinked back tears, pride shining in her weary eyes. Emily froze, her breath catching. She hadn't asked for responsibility, yet she felt her mother's presence beside her, urging her forward. Slowly, she nodded. "I'll do my best," she whispered. Richard's gaze softened. "Your best is all this house ever needed." The days that followed were filled with small but profound changes. Doors that once closed sharply at Margaret's command now stayed open. Conversations among the staff turned from whispers to laughter. Even the old piano in the parlor was uncovered, its keys struck hesitantly by one of the maids in the evenings, filling the halls with music that hadn't been heard in years. On Sunday, Richard invited everyone's staff, neighbors, even distant relatives to the garden for a simple meal. Long tables were set beneath the magnolias, covered with gingham cloths instead of starched linen. Platters of fried chicken, cornbread, watermelon slices, and pitchers of sweet tea filled the tables. Laughter mingled with the sound of cicadas, and children played tag through the grass. Emily found herself seated not at the edges, but in the center, Martha on one side and Lily on the other. "Will you come see the fireworks with us next year?" Lily asked between bites of cobbler, her face sticky with peach. Emily smiled, brushing a curl from the girl's forehead. "I'd like that." Her heart ached with the sweetness of it. For the first time, Independence Day no longer meant loneliness or silence. It meant belonging. As the evening settled, Richard approached Emily by the riverbank, where lanterns bobbed gently in the twilight. The water mirrored the fading colors of the sky. He held out a small envelope, his hand unsteady. "Your mother left this one apart from the others," he said. "She told me it was for when the time was right." Emily opened it slowly. Inside was a single line written in Sarah's graceful hand. "If one day my daughter walks these halls, tell her she was always loved, even in silence." Tears blurred Emily's vision. She pressed the paper to her lips, whispering, "Thank you, Mom." Richard's voice broke behind her. "I should have told you myself. I should have told her. I can't change the years lost, Emily. But if you'll allow me, I'll spend the rest of mine proving I've learned." Emily turned, studying him. His face was marked by age, lined by regret, but softened by sincerity. She thought of her mother again, Sarah, who believed dignity was defended, but who also believed in second chances. Slowly, Emily nodded. "Then we'll start here. Together." The lantern swayed gently above them, their light catching in Richard's tear-filled eyes. For the first time, father and daughter stood side by side, not as strangers, but as family. That night, as fireflies sparkled in the garden and laughter drifted from the kitchen, Emily walked the gravel path beneath the magnolias. She paused to watch a little girl chasing fireflies with a jar, her giggles carrying through the warm night. The scene struck her with unexpected sweetness. Innocence, free of fear. Joy, unchained from silence. Magnolia Estate was no longer a house of shame. It was being reborn slowly, imperfectly, but with hope. And for Emily, who had come seeking truth, what she found was something even greater. A family reclaimed, a legacy restored, and the quiet power of forgiveness strong enough to light even the darkest halls. Sometimes, when the noise of the world finally quiets down, what lingers is not the sound of victory, but the silence of forgiveness. Magnolia Estate, once a house of shadows and unspoken fear, had become, at last, a home reborn. You could almost hear the difference. Laughter in the kitchen, where once there had been whispers. A little girl's giggles chasing fireflies in the garden. The soft shuffle of chairs, as people sat together not out of duty, but out of choice. It's in those small sounds that you recognize when dignity has been restored. And I wonder, dear listener, did this story touch your heart? If it did, press the number 1 in the comments. If you think it could be told better, leave us a 0. Because here, your voice matters as much as the stories we share. But beyond the walls of Magnolia and the pages of Emily's journey, there is something for all of us to hold on to. Love has the power to redeem what pride once destroyed. Forgiveness, whether it is given late in life or through trembling words, can still heal wounds thought too deep to mend. A father, once silent in his fear, found courage to speak at last. A daughter, burdened by unanswered questions, discovered not only her truth, but also her belonging. And an old house, heavy with lies, learned that home is not built from polished silver or grand portraits, but from hearts willing to forgive, to admit wrong, and to begin again. The lesson is simple, but never easy. Unconditional kindness can alter a destiny. Every soul deserves the embrace of family and the warmth of love. Human connection will always outshine money or social standing, because only love gives us a name that cannot be stolen. Perhaps you've seen it in your own life in the way a simple Sunday meal with cornbread and iced tea passed around the table can soften old arguments, or in the quiet peace of a phone call from a child who once drifted away but finally said, "I miss you, Mom. I miss you, Dad." Those moments are our real inheritance. Like a lamp burning quietly in a window, a small act of mercy can guide us through the darkest paths. For many of us listening tonight, maybe rocking gently on a porch swing or sipping coffee at the kitchen table, we know what it feels like to carry regrets too long. We know the stubborn pride that keeps us from speaking the first word of apology, or the fear of rejection when we finally dare to admit we were wrong. But Emily's story and Richard's redemption remind us that even after decades, it is never too late. The past cannot be undone, but the present can still be redeemed. And when love enters the room, when forgiveness is offered, even the hardest walls can crack to let in the light. So take a moment, my friend. Let this story settle in your heart. Think about the people in your own life who might be waiting for your word of reconciliation, or whose word you've been longing to hear. Remember that every home, no matter how grand or how humble, has the chance to be reborn when its people choose compassion over silence. And if this story has touched your heart, share it with someone who might need reminding that second chances are still possible. In the end, what we leave behind is not our wealth, nor the size of our houses, but the love that lives on in the voices that call us family.